Hi, I'm Jan Swafford, and I was asked to say a few things for a class on writing program notes, to say a few things from my actually kind of vast experience writing program notes for orchestras and recordings and things like that. And the best thing to do was to put it on YouTube, so I'm going to leave it there if anybody else wants to see it. So, to the class, to anybody who might be interested in writing program notes in music, the first thing I'll say is what I said to my writing classes for many years about all kinds of writing, which is how you write has to do with who you're writing for. In the case of music, are you writing for musicians or non-musicians? Mostly when you're writing program notes, you think of writing for non-musicians. And what you're trying to do for non-musicians who don't know from dominant seventh chords and modulations to the submedian is give them some kind of a handle on the piece, both in its context and in the composer's life. And you're also giving them a handle, and this is the hard part, expressively, when you can, and always to some degree you can, but that's the tricky part. So when I begin a program note, I'm always concerned with setting up when it was written, but not just when in terms of a date, but when it was written in terms of where the history of things were at that time, not only in music, but in the larger society. It's significant that a lot of Beethoven's symphonies were written during the Napoleonic Wars in Vienna at a certain point in its history. So there's a little bit of setup that way to begin to provide context. And I spend at least half the note, sometimes more, on the background, the context of the when the piece was written, what the genre was, and where the composer was at that point in their lives. So let's go back and use Beethoven as an example. Let's say it's a Beethoven string quartet. Now, people tend to look at composers as sort of a blanket thing. Beethoven is always Beethoven. Well, that's not entirely true. For example, we divide Beethoven's career up into three periods: early, middle, aka heroic, and late, which in my biography of Beethoven I called the poetic period. And he was in a different place in his art in each of those periods. Beethoven happened to have an incredibly big development as a composer. I don't know of anybody else who had the kind of stylistic and personal and spiritual development that he had, as broad and deep. So I want to place it in those terms. And if it's one of the early quartets, the Opus 18s, I might want to explain, to begin with, the tradition. Where was the string quartet at that time? Where was it as a genre? How did people look at it? When Mozart was writing his first string quartets, Haydn was writing his first string quartets, the string quartet was not yet the kind of king of chamber music genres that Haydn made it into. But by the time Beethoven took up the genre, it was. So I want to talk about that. I want to talk about how people viewed string quartets in that time as something particularly profoundly revealing of a composer's craft and, in a way, his soul as an artist. And besides that, I'm always concerned to point out that the setting that this genre was going to be was written for, especially chamber music, when in the 18th century and in effect in Beethoven's life, chamber music was played in chambers. It was played in private places, private homes and palaces, exclusively. Only one of Beethoven's piano sonatas was played in public in his lifetime, and the critic who reviewed the concert said, "What's this person doing, playing a piano sonata in public?" Often piano sonatas were played alone. You played them for your own pleasure. or a few friends, or maybe a concert, a house concert of, a dozen or two people. Even a lot of orchestra music was written for that milieu. And I want people to understand that because it has something to do with how the music takes place. As I say at the end of my Mozart biography, Mozart wrote very much for that kind of milieu, including a lot of his orchestra music. And that's why I say, whereas Beethoven was beginning to move toward public concert halls, and even to a degree later in his chamber music, because he happened to be associated with the first professional string quartet who gave the first chamber subscription series in Europe, I believe. So I want to point all these things out to place the piece in the composer's output, in the time and place it was written, and the milieu for which it was written. And that takes about half or more of the note. In the case of somebody like Charles Ives, he was not writing for a milieu at all, in the sense that his music was not getting played around the time he was writing. It wasn't played till much later. So that's a whole different situation. I might explain where he was in his life at that time and how he tried to get his music heard and basically played it for professionals who all invariably told him he was crazy, and what that involves, what that entails. So then, and in doing this, I don't use too many technical terms. I don't presume too much of what people know about time and place. If I'm going to talk about the Enlightenment, I might do a couple of sentences to kind of characterize the Enlightenment in some kind of very general ways. And it's a little different in every case, of course. Then you get to the music, and this is the hard part, because as somebody wrote once, writing prose about music is like dancing about architecture. I think most people, including me, most musicians, consider music to be a language of the spirit beyond words. And I subscribe to that idea, and I sort of have to subscribe to the dancing about architecture joke too. But it's my job to write about music, and some is easier to write about than others. I find Beethoven much easier to write about than most composers, because I believe Beethoven wanted to be kind of transparent emotionally, expressively in his music. Mozart is much, much harder. But again, it's your job to give people some kind of a handle on the expressive quality of a piece. It is not your job, I think, to tell them what to think and to tell them what to feel. And this gets into a little bit what I feel about expression in music, which I don't want to spend too long on this, but what I believe, what I've come to believe, is that every culture has conventions that represent emotion in music. Indian music has 7 rasas, 7 feelings, which the music is considered to be an expression of those, or a mingling of them. The Baroque had the doctrine of affections, in which musical gestures were associated with certain emotions. And I think by growing up in a musical tradition, you absorb these emotional cues in the music. But these, I think, are the big billboard emotions: happy, sad, glad, mad, joyous, and those sort of things, which are the sort of cliche emotions, unfortunately for us as a writer. Which doesn't mean they're not important. They're terrifically important. Joy is always great. Grief is always sad and can be terrifically moving, even if it's a big cliche emotion. What I do think is personal, and I think music is ultimately the most personal of arts, I think the nuances of the emotion, where they hit us in our particular sensibility and experience, is the individual part. So as I used to tell my students, when we listened to a piece, I always had my students, graduate students in music theory and history, say what they felt about a given piece they were writing or talking about expressively. And they found this hard to get into at first because they'd always been told that you don't do that at school, that that's too personal, it's irrelevant. Well, I said, no, I want you always to tell me how you relate to this music emotionally. And I would go on to say, when a room full of people, musicians or otherwise, agree on the emotional quality of a piece, that's important, and it tells us something about that piece. If they don't agree about the emotional quality, that's also important, and it also tells you something significant about the piece. But what you're trying to do in a program note is to, mostly for non-musicians, just give people, not tell them what to think, not get too specific and minute about the emotional expression, but to give them some idea of the direction of this piece. And to try to do that in imaginative language, which is very hard to do. As often as not, I feel defeated in trying to do that, but I do it and keep doing it because it's my job. With Mozart, that was particularly hard, because Mozart is so often a mingling of subtleties and emotions and so forth. Now, so you want to give them some idea of the general feel of this piece. In terms, if you can be more imaginative, happy, sad, glad, or mad. I remember I did a Boston Symphony pre-concert talk about the Varese Amérique, which is a sort of 25 minutes of just grabbing you by the shoulders and shaking you. And I just said, this is a fierce piece. This piece is absolutely ferocious. It is going to pin your ears back, and that's what you should expect. And that was the handle. And I think that's a reasonably good description of that piece. And I didn't go too much further except to tell them about the siren. There's a fire truck siren in Varese's Amérique, and I told them about that, which also tells you something significant about the piece. That it is wild, it is very much involved with the quality of sounds. It's part of its ferocity that there's a siren, a fire siren in the middle of it. And I told them I was backstage at the Boston Symphony and saw the siren sitting on its pedestal. Because Varese specifies in the score that this should be a siren of the New York City Fire Department. So I looked at backstage at the siren that the percussionists were going to turn that crank on and play, and by God, it said property of the New York City Fire Department. They really did the number on that one. And again, that's something that I knew the audience would appreciate. So the other thing is, so you want to give them some kind of a general, not expressive handle on a piece without getting too much into your own feelings and, going on about how you respond to this piece, though telling them how it hit you at a particular moment in your piece, in some cases at a particular moment in your life might be relevant, might be worthwhile and interesting, and tell them something significant about the piece. Once in a talk about a Mahler symphony, I pointed out that at a point in my life when I was really down, I couldn't listen to Mahler because he made it worse. Very simply, I had to give Mahler a break for a while, and I told them something I think significant about Mahler. I don't know if I'd put that in a written note. I don't know if I'd do that. But you also, the other thing that I want to say finally is that you want to give people a sense of what makes this piece as a totality, as a whole, this piece and no other. Why this symphony is different than every other symphony. Or the personality, the character, the material of this particular piece. What holds it together? What makes it a unity? Or what challenges a sense of unity in it in some cases. So in that, I go into a little bit, I might use the term sonata form that I know some people will know and some won't. I might talk about keys a little bit, but I don't do enough technical thing so that people just get lost and give up on the note. But I still try to convey something about what it seems to me holds this piece together, first of all, emotionally, that is Beethoven is very much involved in kind of quasi-dramatic and emotional narratives, I think, in his music, like the famous thing in the Fifth Symphony, From Darkness to Light, From Fatefulness to Triumph, or something like that, something in that direction, which I think is quite true about that piece and intended. And I think he intended us for us to understand that. Mozart doesn't do that kind of thing, really, except sometimes in his more minor key Sturm und Drang kinds of pieces, maybe. So I have to find other things, but sometimes I talk about thematic relationships because that's something people sort of can understand if that's something really kind of, I think, kind of upfront, and so forth and so on. I somehow try to convey the uniqueness of that piece, which is why I don't play the influence game too much. Because while it's certainly true that everybody is influenced, the influences that went into a piece don't necessarily tell you that much about the individuality of that piece. So I don't get too much involved in that, especially in notes. Just to say that this, maybe Beethoven lifted a tune from Mozart, which he did a few times, might be worth mentioning, but it doesn't actually tell you anything about that piece most of the time. So there is the sort of things that go into a note, and after that it's a matter of writing and trying to be as vivid and imaginative without being too goofy, without being too, without running off the rails in one kind or another. But there's where you have to use your imagination to bring that piece alive and to have in the prose, in the quality, the aesthetic quality of the prose, the nature of the prose, even the style and sometimes rhythm of the prose, even to somehow reflect what you're talking about in a way that's interesting to read. Because dry notes are the bane of program notes, liner notes, things that are scholarly and dry in tone. When you're writing for scholars, you want to be scholarly. When you're writing for regular people, you want to write in a way that is absorbing and informative to regular people and talks to them in terms they can understand and will be interested in. So that's all I have to say. It's all I can think of. I've run on much too long, so good luck in the class, and good luck to anybody else who happens to stumble on this, and stay safe and farewell.